Hello, hello, hello. One more lecture. Lecture 5, the rules. So last week we talked about how to get data, make a database, how to design a database, how to design the structure, how to design the relationships. So that's a big part of a database is getting the structure right. That's a very important thing to get the structure right. But then the next part is once you've got the structure right, how do you make it so that the data that goes in is correct? It's in the correct format, that it's correct, that it follows the rules, the established rules for that type of data. And this is where, last week, that lecture, that could have been given to anybody. It didn't really have a health focus. The same rules apply no matter what. There's this lecture actually talks about how do we get that data from a health point of view? How can we make it so that it works in health? So what's different about health? Health, the data is shared. Everybody's got a hand in that data. You never make data just for yourself. You're going to share it with the community health center, with the GPs, with the, between hospitals, with the government. Health is a big time operation. Lots of people deal with that data. They all got a hand in the data. So you got to make it the standardized. We talk much more about that next semester. Somebody else is going to talk about that next semester. But today we want to talk about just if you're making a database, you don't really care about all those standards. What's the minimum you can do to make your database have the correct structure? And that's what we're going to tell you. Cool. Oh no, I don't want to press escape to get out of that. You want a new page. So we're going to design the structure. We've already last week we designed the structure, the relationships. This week we're going to talk about the formatting of the fields, what actually the fields look like, and then the rules for the data that goes into that database. The things you're going to learn about today are the field specifications. How do you specify a field? How do you, and what does it look like? The data model. What the data model is sort of the big picture view of the data, and data dictionary is the small picture view of the database. And yeah, those are the words, the bingo words you're going to be looking for in this particular lecture. I just thought I should open up LMS so that I can show you some of that stuff when time comes. So I'm just going to zip over there. I'm going to go up to My Apps, open up the Intelligent Hub, go to the desktop and launch from browser. So we got the VM starting up. I'm going to, Alexa, please set a timer for 15 minutes. 15 minutes, starting now. So it will tell me when it's time. There. So those are coming. I'm going to show you some database stuff in a minute. So we got So the things this week is the field formatting and the business rules. That's what I wanted to see. So once we've got the tables, we need to specify the fields. So we've got the fields already, but we need to zoom in and say, well, what is actually in those fields? So there's this idea of business rules to specify the fields. So, for example, the date of birth. The computer just says, well, it's a date, but the business rules might say things like, well, we're a youth organization, so therefore the date of birth must make the person be under 18. So the business rules constrain it apart from the other things. So another example might be you've got 10 different genders. You got genders, you got male and female and indeterminate, and you've got YYX and you got XXY and all these different genders in the real world, all these different genders. But your business rules might say, meh, we only care about 2 genders. So we're only going to constrain that to 2 genders. And so we might say in the gender column, it's got to be one of, 3 values. Just so the business rules constrain the database. And why do we want to constrain it? We want it to be correct. We want the data to be shareable and correct. Let me tell you a story. So the Department of Health they did a survey of all the data that they collected all across the whole thing, all the different data sources. They collect data everywhere, and they found that they were collecting gender in like 10 different ways. Sometimes male was one, sometimes male was M, sometimes, there'd be three different kinds of genders, and sometimes there'd be seven. It was really hard to transfer the data, to coordinate the data. And also imagine if your point of view of you were a service provider and you had to provide that data to DHHS. And sometimes they'd want the data with male being one, and sometimes they'd want the data with male being M. Really, how painful is that? So let's try not to do that. Let's try to have some standards. So we want some standards to specify our fields, and we want the data to be constrained according to these business rules. What's the rule for gender? What's the rule for birth date? What's the rule for principal diagnosis? Now, for you second year students, principal diagnosis is this thing that coders do. They go and they look at the medical record, they assign a code to it from the ICD-10 table. You saw that in the last tutorial. What's the rule for principal diagnosis? What characters? What can it be? So there's all these rules that help the data be correct, and you can do that in Access, and you can't do that in Excel, because Excel, you could just put in any old garbage into the cell. Excel says fine, whereas the databases can say no. We want the data to be constrained in a certain way. So when you're designing your databases, you want to constrain the data so that it's as correct as it possibly can be. Otherwise, you end up with garbage, and nobody's happy with garbage, especially because you'll have to deal with it later on when you're trying to do reports, and it's messy and ugly. So make your data clean. So data rules are rules that apply whenever a field is used. For example, a date must be a proper date. 14/14/2014, that's not a date. There's no month number 14. Gender must be a certain set of things. Urgency must be a certain set of things. So in Access, there's two ways. You can either have validation rules in the table itself, or you can have reference tables. And you saw, you'll see that in the tutorials probably. And in your assignment, you should have those things. You should have validation rules and reference tables and things like that. Yeah. So yeah, that's data rules. Now I'm going to go a little bit sideways on you here, and we're going to talk about the theory of health data in health. So you got this idea of a health concept, something that happens to somebody out there in the world, an admission, a leg, a fracture. Those are things that you can just kind of picture in your head. But what is that? How does that relate to a data item? What's the thing? How does it work? So then a data item might be an admission date. An admission date has a field name and has a value. Reason for admission has a field name and a value. And so you got to sort of know these terms, data item and health concept, as a way to they should have been in the bingo actually. Yeah. So so the data item names in this case are the admission date, reason for admission. The data item values are this date and the broken leg. So it's just the ways to talk about the things. We want to constrain the data item values based on whatever the types of things are in the data item name. So a data item is a single entity which codes or rules can be applied. A field also, or a data element. And you want to be able to define these things. And so how do you define a data item? What's the proper form of a data item? Well, there's a lot of things to constrain it. There's how do you validate it? What's it related to? Who came up with these rules? The name, the meaning, definition, what context is it used in, what's the computer ID? For example, diag code is a computer ID often for a diagnosis code. Representational form, what is the form of it? What is it going to look like? A ICD-10 code has got a letter, a couple numbers, a dot, and a couple more numbers. The layout, that's also the size restrictions is in there. So all these things for every data item has all these things apply. Wow. this is health. This is health data. Yeah, it's a lot of data, but it's really in health. There's all these types of data, and there's all these things that apply to it. The whole bureaucracy. Australian Institute of Health and Welfare (AIHW) does this full time. They manage this stuff. They go through and say what's the proper thing, how is it formed. So you don't have to do it. Somebody's done it already. That's the good thing. And they made this data dictionary, National Health Data Dictionary, the AIHW did. And really, on the internet from 1996, was there even an internet in 1996? There was, and the reason it came about was to publicize this kind of stuff. Yeah, there's an international equivalent, and it's a formal way of defining things. Isn't that good? Your job is solved. You go there and you look up and you say, this is what my data item is going to be. The spin cycle on this washing machine is going to be immortalized in video. So the current data dictionary is a Meteor AHW. You probably heard about that in some of your other classes. Well, now you got a use for it. And I'm going to show you what it looks like for principal diagnosis. And it's a single reference point. So if you are making a database that keeps track of principal diagnoses, and your colleague in whoop Western Australia is doing the same thing, and you both use this AHW, and then when it comes time to share the data, well, it's still going to be painful, but it'll be less painful than if you both came up with your own solution on its own. So it's a national standardization, and despite that, it's still a hot mess, but it, is in the progress of getting better. As well, there's data models, which are collections of data. We'll talk about, again, more next semester. So here's an example of principal diagnosis. There's the code, alphabetic, numeric, and optional dot numeric with another numeric, also optional dot. Just to define the code type is a thing. It's a data element. It's principal diagnosis for a patient, the definitions. Where does the data come? The value domain. Where does the data come from? It comes from this thing called the ICD-10-AM, Australia Modification Coding Manual. If you want to put a code into a principal diagnosis field in a database, well, it better come from one of these. If it doesn't, your database is not standard. There, make your database standard. And this is how you do it. Follow the instructions. Or, even better, get a job making the instructions up. Write this stuff. Decide. Get together with committees of people and decide what the proper way to define all these things are and keep them up to date. And job for life. Another example, really much more closer to home. Name title. Do you even know what a name title is? An honorific of address, commencing a name. When used when addressing a healthcare client by name, whether in mail, person, or in phone. So, for example, Sir. If I got the Order of Australia, I would be Sir Dennis Woolersheim. That would be an honorific. If I went into the priesthood or became a monk, I would be Brother Dennis Woolersheim. Dame, that probably wouldn't apply to me. Doctor, Mister, I can't get away with doctor, actually. Not that kind of doctor. So field size 0 to 12. So they counted. They said, well, the longest one's 12. We don't need that. That's all we need for that one. And in accordance with the standard interchange of client information. And there's some rules too. There's some rules associated with these things. So there's dame, for example. What's the rule associated with dame? Well, you gotta be female if you're a dame. If brother, BR, you gotta be male. It's one of those things. So there's rules associated with those things from a long time ago, set down in the world, and this is a way to define it and make your data be correct. Masters should be youngers. Doctor and professor should only be applicable to clients greater than 20 years of age. Warning edit. So look at this. It's a warning edit. So it's not actually wrong. You just got to warn people when that happens. Software is hard. You got to make all this stuff work. There might be a 12-year-old professor. Not me, but somebody. Now these ones are more hard. Miss, Mrs., Ms., sister, dame, only for the girls, females, something like that. Cool. So that's data. That's the data. That's the data fields. Now, also, there's these things called data models. So it's a pictorial representation of data relationships. It's a big picture. Oftentimes, it starts with a big picture. For example, there's a thing called the GP data model, which is a huge data model. All the data you might find at a general practice. Who would have thought there was that much data in general practice? There is massive. They spent years on it. And so, for example, if you wanted to capture general practice patient encounter data, it's in the model. You can go look it up. You can say, well, what's the set of things that goes with the general practice patient encounter? What's a patient encounter? What happens when, what kind of data do you want to capture when Joe patient walks into the doctor's office and says, I'm sick. What do you want to capture from that? Well, there's a guideline for it. I'll tell you. So the first level domains these are all the domains of data. So the big picture, patient, schedules, provider, trial, resources, decision support. Oh, that's just to begin with. And that's just GPs today. In 10 years, there'll be another 3 things on there. So again, job for life, keeping all this in check. And that's what health information managers are good for. Conversing with the GPs, conversing with the data people, making it all. So anyways, we want to find out what a patient encounter. So let's zoom into patient. And these are all the things under patient, the clinical profile, what kind of person it is, person event, what kind of person, like what kind of profile it is, what kind of person it is, what kind of service it was, what was the encounter like, what information about the patient, the notes about the patient, bit tedious, kind of high level, a lot of detail. But anyway, we're going to zoom into the GP encounter data, and the GP encounter has these 4 fields: subjective, objective, assessment, and plan data. If you've been around in health for a while, you'll recognize that. SOAP, it's the things that a doctor is supposed to write down when they meet you. Subjectively, they look kind of sick. Objectively, their temperature's high. Assessment, I think they got a fever. Plan, let's tell them to go to bed and to go to sleep. So that's the stuff they're supposed to capture. So for every encounter, there should be these fields as a way to capture the data. GP model, patient encounter data. Yeah, somebody's helped you out. There's a lot of data. There's a lot of data. There's a lot of data. I mean, banks, they've got data. Engineering companies, they've got data. Airlines, they've got data. Health, we've got data. It's messy. It deals with humans. Humans are messy. Lots of humans. Job for life. Anyways, so when you're building the database, you just to recap, you establish the entities, the tables, the relationships as well. You define the data items, you find the rules and the codes, you establish the lookup files, you establish the relationships. Alexa, stop. Let's see. Oh, and I was just too slow. So it actually doesn't wait for 15 minutes. That's a good little test. I'm going to log into that again so I can show you that. That is just annoying. Alexa, set a timer for 14 minutes. 14 minutes. Yeah, do all that stuff and make sure you look at the data dictionaries. So how do you do that in Access? You control it by the data type. So you say this field's for dates, this field's for numbers, this field's just yes or no. Text is the least restrictive data type. You can put anything in a text field. But dates are constrained by themselves just by the type of data. You can only put a date in the date field. So there's an example of a date data type. So when you change, no, that isn't an example of a date data type. That's a number data type. Why does it say date there? But anyways, you can change the number of decimal places, the input mask, other things there. So there's 2 different ways to validate things. You can have validation rules. So that's useful for small constant validations. Gender. I even these days, I wouldn't validate gender using a validation rule because it changes so much. Yeah. But here's an example of a validation rule using gender. So M or F or U or I. So that's, it says then you can't do that. If it's anything outside of that, gender must be, this message will pop up. So that's in Access how you do it. You put a little message down there, you validate your data. So in your database that you build for the assignment, you should validate your data as much as you can. Reference tables is a much better way to validate your data. So it's, the reference table has got a set of codes, and it allows for a lookup facility. And you can once you the lookup, you can only use the data there. So the thing about that is the reference tables, you allowed them to use them multiple places. So for example, in our database assignment, the urgency lookup table has got that's the structure of it: urgency code, urgency description, and you can only put in one of those three values because that's the only thing that's in the table. I've showed you this in the tutorial, how to create a lookup, but the lookup looks like that. So you can only choose one of those three values. That's the only thing you can put in there. Now let's go see what that looks like from in the database. So we've got that running now. Oh, no, it didn't even start. Well, I'm not going to show you what it looks like in the database because I showed you that in the tutorial. So